So there was August, September. There was bitter fighting for Kharkiv, a city, second largest city in Ukraine, city in northeast Ukraine, predominantly ethnic Russian, and they had wanted to join with the breakaway republics, but they were unable to. And back in 2014, they were epic fighting for it, and the Ukraine it's occupied by Ukraine. Uh, Ukraine back in September, Ukrainians succeeded in they made several offensives in that region, also southern Donbass region to retake area. They failed. The offensives largely failed or petered out. But in this case, the Ukrainian offensive succeeded. They took or retook the city of Izium, which is a city in the oblast in the region with which Kharkiv is the capital of, and this was a bombshell. There's apparently, I'm definitely not a military expert. There are some sites, some YouTube channels and people to look into if you're interested in military analysis. I'm not that person, but I'm getting data from various people. So, it was retaken, Izium was retaken by the Ukrainians. This was a bombshell, a lot of anger within the Russian ranks, like how did we allow this to happen, what the hell's going on here? So apparently it was lightly defended, that area. The Russian line was kind of thin around that area, and NATO was able to satellite reconnaissance. They were tracking this very closely. They told the Ukrainians, okay, there's an opening, go in and take it, and the Ukrainians did. So it goes back to Russia did make a screw up. It was a setback, political and military setback, but some kind, Western media, American media was so gleeful. Oh, the Ukrainians now are winning. They're going to retake Crimea, which is nonsense. Ukrainians are winning. See, Putin's going to be overthrown. They're back to the original narrative. Well, okay. First of all, the Izium offensive, Ukrainians did win one, both militarily and political. However, some put into some perspective, it's a one-time thing. Ukraine seriously is not capable of another offensive like that. They're losing, according to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, between 200 and 300 men a day, either killed or wounded, putting out of commission, losing between 200 and 300 men a day. No army can stand to have that happening, and no army can take that. So, also, interestingly, we don't know how many people, but there are videos, I've seen this on YouTube, of there are a fair number of Americans there, people speaking in a speaking English with a Midwestern accent. There seem to be large numbers of Americans there. Maybe mercenaries, contract soldiers, they may be like special forces out of uniform, some legal technicalities, so they're technically not active duty military, some weird things, but it seems like a large, I don't know how many, we don't know how many, but a large number of those people are fighters in the Ukrainian side, are Westerns, are Americans now. The Ukrainian army is highly depleted. Anyway, it seemed to have been politically motivated, this offensive. There was talk of giving Ukraine another $5 billion. Blinken was in Ukraine. And of course, when Ukraine gets more aid, they have to show they can give bang for the buck. Yeah, we can win. We can still win this thing. Their narrative is we can still win this thing, which is nonsense. By the way, Lindsey Graham said, Ukrainians are brave people. They're going to fight to the last Ukrainian. No good. They make sure, NATO and the West make sure this is happening. Like Ukraine was put up to this whole thing by the West. It's a meat grinder. I hate to use that term, but it's a meat grinder. They're middle-aged men from Western Ukraine, guys who are out of shape. They joined this territorial guard, kind of like a National Guard, hoping they wouldn't be sent to the front. Now they're being sent to the front, poorly trained, poorly equipped. They're being used as cannon fodder, and they know it. Morale is very low. Soldiers are refusing to be deployed. And they're just meat grinders for political reasons. Reasons for these offensives are political reasons. Even Zelensky's generals were against it, but NATO kept telling, keep doing it for political reasons. Okay, the Ukrainians did take Izium. That's true. It was a setback for Russia. There was a lot of outcry among Russian social media. And the subsequent week after that, it looks like the Russians are drawing back and ceding territory to the Ukrainians. Well, Scott Ritter got on again. He's kind of vindicated. Scott Ritter was right. He got a firestorm of criticism for saying this, but yeah, he's absolutely right. The flood of U.S. Western weaponry to Ukraine is making a difference. Oh, keep in mind, though, It's unclear how much this weapon actually gets Ukraine, gets the Ukrainian army. Relatively little does. There's a famous CBS News documentary, which said only 30% of it actually gets the army. They're sold in the black market. They were forced to backtrack. Say, oh yeah, it's true originally, but now we have no, it's not happening now. It's bullshit. But CBS News was the rare bit of honesty for the corporate media. Very rare bit of honesty, but actually 30% of it, only 30% of this aid is getting to Ukraine. Rand Paul and they had a bill on some oversight, some massive aid given to Ukraine. That was nope, we can't have that. So it's unclear how much this weapon is actually getting there, but whatever, it is making a difference. It is slowing down. They're slowing down the Russians or something. Now, the Russians don't have enough troops to do what they knew. The political Scott Ritter pointed out they do not have enough troops to do what their state military objectives. He said, I think it was like 3 weeks, shortly after the Eastern Offensive, say, look, we got to face it. They can't accomplish their goals, their stated goals in this war, without an extra 200,000 men. And that's what they did. So the Russians reacted in two different ways. Did two different things. First, they had referendums. The referendums were already scheduled. They were brought closer in time. They were scheduled for December or whatever. That they had them 2 weeks ago. Referendums in the two People's Republics, Lugansk People's Republic, Donetsk People's Republics, Zaporozhye region Oblast, and Kherson Oblast or region that were scheduled. And the Russians don't completely control Zaporozhye or Kherson anyway, but so they had these referendums, and there was an outcry. The West mocked it. It didn't sound, it's all not legitimate. Apparently in Donetsk, something like 99.8% of people voted to join Russia. The choices were to stay part of Ukraine or to join Russia, and people, it's like the old Soviet-style elections where 99.9% of everybody votes for the approved candidate. Well, okay, some perspective here. First of all, it's self-selecting. I think the referendums are legitimate. It's self-selecting. People who are pro-Ukrainian, for one thing, aren't going to vote. The Ukrainian government even threatened anyone to vote in these elections with 10 years in jail. And I seriously doubt there's any single person still in Donetsk who wants to be part of Ukraine. They had a bitter civil war for the last 8 years. Nobody there still wants to be part of Ukraine. Okay, so it's totally legitimate. With Odessa, with Donetsk and Lugansk, totally legitimate. I think somewhat lesser for I think it was Kherson at 80% wanted to join Russia. I still think that's legitimate, totally legitimate. Well, there was a outcry in the Western media. It's not legitimate. There was a German. I don't know the whole story, but apparently a German guy who's president of an energy company, and he went over as an elect. It sounds like I saw a brief interview with him. Patrick Lancaster interviewed him. There were Western election observers, and he went as an election observer, and he came back and he was fired from his job, and he was denied a 35-year pension. He's trying to find a job with a Russian energy company now. That's how they treat people. I mean, I think these referendums were legitimate. So what it means politically, the purpose of these referendums, they are now part of, they have to be ratified, which they are. They're now an integral part of the Russian Federation, of Russia. So an attack on these regions would be just as much as an attack on Moscow or St. Petersburg. It's part of Russia. Next is Russia has a general mobilization. Russia has not general mobilization, a partial mobilization. There's been, again, a lot of hysteria and confusion about this in the media, in the Western media, and to some extent in the Russian media as well. What I understand, first, there's a difference between conscription and mobilization. Mobilization gets people who were already in the military, had military training, and I don't know how the Russian system works. There are people like that considered reserves. Considered in the reserve, they're liable to be called up. Russia, I know, has 25 million reservists, and 300,000 of these were called up. 300,000 of these people were called up. And not all these people will be deployed to Ukraine. I don't know what percentage. A lot of them are actually going to replace other troops, like border guards, guard duty, and whatever, do other functions, while more people are active duty troops will then be freed up to go to Ukraine. There was a story, people shared it over Facebook. Apparently, some like maybe 180,000, 200,000 different figures of people, young men, were trying to get out of Russia to avoid the mobilization. Now, the mobilization, by the way, it's not conscription. They're not pulling people out of college. They're not just getting people off the streets. It's not conscription. They do have conscription in Russia. It's something separate. They do have it. It's a modified conscription. It's, as I understand, pretty easy to get out of it. There are lots of exemptions for it, but the military doesn't, in Russia or anywhere, does not really want people who really don't want to be there. They do want people of some measure of enthusiasm for whatever they're doing. So anyway, so they're not pulling people out of college. They're getting people who already have military training and already military background. So anyway, 180 to 200,000 people either left Russia or tried to leave Russia. Airports and areas were packed. Kind of ironic that Russians now, because of the sanctions, they can't go anywhere. They can't leave Russia. Like they can't go to Europe anyway. Turkey right now is one of the nearest places Russians can go to. So apparently airports were packed with people trying to fly to Istanbul. Interestingly, Turkey was also cutting off the SWIFT for complicated political reasons. They were cutting off SWIFT payments, so straining Russians who were there. But anyway, airports were packed with Russians. These people who were trying to leave were liberal elements. There is, I don't know how large this element is. They were not in the military. For the most part, the military does not want these people. There's a sizable people in cities, petty bourgeois layers in Moscow and St. Petersburg, who really don't like pro-Western, really don't like Putin, that really were opposed to the Ukraine war. There's some protests at the beginning of the war that kind of ended, but really don't. And they have a tendency to overreact. Oh my God! And they're desperately trying to flee out of Russia. Probably most of the people came back by now. They're not at risk for being mobilized. The military doesn't want these people. They're the layer that color revolutions come out of. I mean, I support people's right to protest. Ironically, I hate war, and I've been to many, many anti-war rallies in the U.S., and Russia is a different context. All the wars that the U.S. has fought, at least my lifetime, and many decades before my lifetime, were imperialist wars. And I'd be totally against it. Not on pacifist grounds, but on anti-imperialist grounds. If I lived in Russia, it would be a kind of a different situation, very complicated, but it would be a little different situation. I don't know, I mean, I'm trans, they probably wouldn't want me, but I don't know, anyway. So these liberal layers were trying to get out of Moscow, and people are sharing this on Facebook. They're not the people who are being mobilized. To balance that off, besides the mobilization, like 300,000 people were called up, an additional 200,000 people volunteered. Like in the smaller cities and the countryside, there's a wave of patriotism and Russian nationalism. Essentially, the reason why Putin, the Russian leadership, the media personalizes as Putin, but the Russian leadership was kind of reluctant to go for a full-scale war. It's a special the war in Ukraine is a special military operation, technically a police action. They're reluctant. A full-scale war is asking a lot of a society. There are economic strains, economic sacrifices. It is asking a lot of society, and Putin, the leadership, had to wait till like the public was ahead of them. They couldn't just, they couldn't wait. They had to wait till the public. And now there's a lot of anger at these reversals, at losing Izium, and other things. A lot of bickering going on, Russian social media, Russian talk shows, Russian media in general. A lot of anger. So the government now is like catching up to it. They're getting more aggressive. So no one really knows when this offensive is going next. The Russians are going to counterattack. They're with 300,000 troops. They're apparently training them, mobilizing them. It takes some time, a couple weeks, maybe a month, probably a month or so. I don't really know. They've had some screw-ups, I've heard, but anyway, the media, the American media is whipping up, oh, see, there's chaos in Russia, Putin's going to be overthrown soon, which is nonsense, which is total nonsense. So I don't really know how this is going to play out. Russia will undoubtedly win. When and how, I don't really know. My guess they're going to come. This front, by the way, is stabilized. They've stabilized the front. Russians have taken some ground. There's a fight brewing, or bitter fighting right now for the city of Bakhmut, which I believe is in northeastern Donbass as well. It's like a pivotal city. It's a gateway to a large regional area. So what the Russians are doing, they're withdrawing, they are ceding some land, big chunk of land to the Ukrainians, so they have a shorter defense perimeter, they have a wider region to defend. They're pulling back, and they're attacking Bakhmut. They want to take the city of Bakhmut. Most likely they will in the near future, and there's going to be sort of a game changer. And then a month or so from now, Russians are going to bring their troops in. The interesting thing, Elon Musk story. He had this Elon Musk. There were illusions in Elon Musk. He's part of the security state, Silicon Valley mogul, a bit of a legend in his own mind. He's a military contractor. He had this, I forget what it's called, SatLink system, satellite link communications and reconnaissance system, which he gave to the use for the government of Ukraine. Probably the Pentagon is really behind it. Apparently, two things. Apparently, he's came out as a peacekeeper. Supposedly has wants to start some peace negotiations. The Zelensky regime is really pissed off at him. There's some drama going on about that. That's not really meaningful. It's kind of bullshit. But basically, his SatLink, I think it's called SatLink, is down. And the buzz is some people think that Elon Musk himself got pissed off and turned it off, which I don't think is true. I seriously doubt that. Other people think, well, the Pentagon turned it off because the Russians had infiltrated. I don't think that's true either. I think the Russians took it down, which is a big blow for Ukraine, a huge, huge blow for Ukraine. So it's it's beginning to turn somewhat. I think this is the beginning of a, I don't know how it's going to play out. My hunch, the war will probably be over by late December, January. Could be wrong. But my hunch, it'll be a Russian victory. Russians will roll onto Kiev. They'll have to take the whole thing. By the way, there's a buzz going on about nukes. Putin never threatened to use nukes. His statement was highly distorted. He never threatened it. What he did say a month and a half ago or so, something like he reiterated traditional, this is known to be Russian military doctrine, saying like if you use nukes, we're going to retaliate. Like a world in which Russia doesn't exist won't be a world worth saving. A bit questionable, but okay. And he just was repeating known Russian military doctrine. We're going to retaliate. If you use nukes, we're going to retaliate. Well, what he said was taken out of context and made it by the American media and Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and by taking it out of context, made it look like Putin was threatening to use nukes, which he wasn't. He did not threaten nukes. He never said that. And then there's weird buzz. Apparently, a couple days ago, about a week ago, Zelensky talked about using tactical nukes. So we're going to have to use tactical nukes, supposedly small nuclear weapons. He walked away from that really fast. He did walk away from that, but then Biden himself talked about this is a nuclear Armageddon. We are facing Armageddon. Yeah, he's right. But due to his policies, his fault, we're facing Armageddon. I don't think it's going to be a nuclear war or use of nukes, but this is really dangerous talk on behalf of the West. It's a nuclear war bullshit. This is really, you can't have a winnable nuclear war. Weird case where liberals on Twitter or elsewhere salivating over the prospect of a limited nuclear war. This is exact role reversal. They're doing what Republicans did years ago, what the right wing did years ago. It's odd. Finally, the Germany is kind of facing economic collapse. They've been last 30 years have been heavily dependent on Russian oil, Russian natural gas. Europe in general, especially Germany, they closed off a lot of their nuclear reactors. France uses a lot of nuclear energy, not Germany, but this has placed Germany in a really horrible situation. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline was destroyed. And we use the word cui bono, Latin phrase, like the legal phrase, Lenin used it, means like cui bono, I think it's pronounced, who benefits, and we don't know who did it, but, we know who did it, who benefits. There were protests starting in Germany. Like, this is going to be a horrible winter for Germany. They'll have no gas, no heat. It's going to be a horrible, the economy's collapsing. Economy's just shutting down. Germany was the economic powerhouse of Europe and shutting down, and possibly permanently. And people, there were mass protests developing against this. Well, turn Nord Stream back on, turn the pipeline back on. And, well, the destruction of this pipeline took a bargaining chip away from Russia. Like, Germany now can't turn the pipeline back on because it no longer exists. Politically, the U.S. benefits from this a lot. Keeps Germany down. Germany now will be heavily dependent on U.S. natural gas and oil. From the U.S. basically, Biden was begging Saudi Arabia to pump out more oil. They're not doing it, which is hysterical. Not hysterical, but it's really interesting. Shows how U.S. power is plummeting. Saudi Arabia is it's a horrible regime, but Saudi Arabia is ever so slightly more and more pivoting towards Russia. They fuck you, the U.S. That's interesting. So anyway, So the destruction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was a bombshell, no pun intended. And really, Germany is and the UK will be especially very hard hit by the sanctions, by which is backfiring on them. The leadership doesn't want to let go at all. The left, the chairman, the Sarah Wagenknecht, who's the leader of Die Linke, and they've been a bit all over the place. She's been saying some good stuff recently. So we have to. The sanctions are, whatever you think of the Ukraine war, these sanctions are insane. They're destroying Russia. They're self-destructive. And there's a firestorm of criticism against her. Some of the Die Linke threatened to expel her from her own party, which shows how horrible Die Linke is. The Kerch Bridge was bombed. Believe, as I understand, it's a truck bombing. Quite obviously, Ukrainians or someone working for the Ukrainians did it. It's a bridge which connected Crimea to the Russian mainland. Crimea is now part of Russia. It was used as a supply route for military equipment and stuff, but it was a setback, not a huge military setback for Russia, but it was kind of bad public relations. The destruction of the satellite link system was an enormous setback for Ukraine, as far as I understand. So we're in this impasse. It's I think this is the calm before the storm. I think next days or weeks or within a month, I suspect there'll be a huge Russian counteroffensive, and this is part of a struggle. Russia's going to win Ukraine. It's impossible for Ukraine to defeat Russia. Completely impossible. By the way, it looks like their Ukrainian army, kind of no longer exists. I don't know this for sure, but it seems like it's largely American special forces, a lot of it. I mean, they don't have any more men. They're losing 200 and 300 men a day. I don't think they really exist as an army anymore. The original equipment is all gone. A lot of the original listed personnel, conscripts are gone. They're the Americans. I think. I don't know. We'll see what comes out. So I think Russia's going to start to become very aggressive. They're going to hit the NATO command centers in Ukraine. And Russia will win January. And we'll see where January. This is the beginning of a titanic struggle. It's going to go on for decades. The U.S. is not going to release this and relinquish it's a gem easily. It's going to be a titanic struggle going on for the next couple of decades at least. Anyway, okay, just briefly some sources where I get information from. Where I get information from, alternate media, everything the mainstream media says about the Ukraine conflict is crap. I get a Scott Ritter, as I mentioned, really good commenter. He's interviewed by various YouTube channels, Richard Medhurst, Danny Haifong, a Black Agenda Report, some interesting interviews with him. Just type in, get YouTube, type in Scott Ritter, you'll come up with recent. Colonel Douglas McGregor is a general, I think he's a retired U.S. general. He was sort of close to Trump, but he was kind of disillusioned in some ways. He almost sounds like an anti-imperialist leftist. Talking to him, really the horrible things the U.S. is doing. Interesting listening to him. He's on the right, but kind of on the anti-globalist, populist right, you might say. Interesting guy. Other sources, the Duran is a good source. Two Greek guys. Alex Christoforou, who's a younger Greek-American who lives in Cyprus. He gives videos of his walking tours of Nicosia, various places in Cyprus. And there's Alexander Bokouris, who's an older Greek Cypriot British guy who lives in London. Interesting guy. I love his received pronunciation, very chummy type speaking style. Anyway, Bokouris himself gives very detailed analysis. I don't agree with everything they say, their politics. I don't agree with some of their slants, but the guys, both these guys have a wealth of details, what's going on militarily and politically in Europe. So the Duran is a good source. Moon of Alabama blog is a good source. The comments, some of the comment people in the comments are really idiots, but some comments are really interesting and enjoy reading it. Some other sources, they're the main ones. Brian Berlatic, New Atlas. He's an American, former U.S. Marine, American, lives in Thailand. And he's a really good military analyst. He's very pro-Chinese, basically, super pro-Chinese, it seems, following one thing. But he has excellent analysis, detailed analysis of what's going on the ground in Ukraine. He's been following it very closely. There are some other sources and channels. Those are the main ones I follow. Okay, I'm just going to briefly end this with some narratives on the left, which I hear a lot still on the Facebook left. I disagree with. They'll say, well, we shouldn't, people on the left, socialists or the working class, we shouldn't take a side. both Russia and the U.S. are capitalist imperialist countries and we shouldn't take a side, or that Ukraine, the Ukrainian-speaking working class and the Russian-speaking working class in Ukraine should unite and kick out NATO on one hand and kick out the Russians on the other. You don't hear that too much anymore because it doesn't make any sense. Or finally, that Russia is fascist too. You hear the memes all over the place on Facebook. Spider-Man meme of the Azov battalion fighting the Wagner group. Okay, my take on these, I think these ideas, memes totally miss the point. And I probably have mentioned this in some earlier videos. They totally miss the point. Yes, Russia's capitalist. Yes, sure. Yes, absolutely. However, it's different from American-dominated neoliberal capitalism, and this is important. Michael Hudson, the economist, Marxist or Marxian economist, makes the case. Michael Hudson, by the way, is one of the most interesting people. He'd win a contest for most interesting man alive. He's literally Leon Trotsky's godson. He's in his 80s. His parents joined the Communist League in the early Trotskyist movement and the Teamsters Rebellion in 1934. Michael Hudson himself has a career as a musician. I believe he was a conductor of the Stockholm Philharmonic at one point, and he was an academic economist. He worked for the Hudson Institute, no relation to him, but he worked for the Hudson Institute with Herman Kahn, who was a right-wing. Anyway, now Michael Hudson's currently, he's a professor, full professor at 3 universities in China, and he teaches his classes in Mandarin. I mean, guys, like, whatever you think of him, the most interesting man alive. Anyway, basically, he says about Russia, says, yeah, it's capitalist. But according to the IMF, 70% of Russia's GDP comes from the state sector. The 12 biggest firms in Russia are state-run firms. The commanding heights of the economy, much of it is in private hands. So yeah, it is capitalist. Some people say China is socialist or deformed worker state or whatever. Russia is capitalist, that's true. But it is much more of a state-directed capitalism. In fact, Russia recently introduced 7-year plans from Chinese style, 7-year plans to their energy sector, which is a big part of their economy. They're largely a planned capitalist, state capitalist planned economy, you might say. And the Russian working class does have an interest in avoiding the nightmare of the 90s. Now, more deeper than that, it's a proxy war. Obviously, a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia would be faced with this situation no matter what form of government they have. No matter, they could be a socialist worker state, they could be a monarchy, they could be a military dictatorship. It doesn't make people say Putin's a conservative Russian nationalist. Yes, he is, absolutely. So what? Like in 1936, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. I would support Ethiopia, no doubt whatsoever. Even though I don't politically support Haile Selassie or the corrupt feudal regime he had there, I would support Ethiopia against Russia. This is the same thing. That doesn't mean I politically support Putin or really care about Putin. And Russia's capitalist, but they are fighting it's a war of defense against its regime change. The neocons openly say that they want to overthrow Putin, that they want to sell Navalny, or it could be anyone else, a Russian Juan Guaido figure. Russia would be pushed back to the 90s, neoliberalism forever, Russian state might be broken up, which they're talking about this too, decolonization of Russia, break up Russia, and China would be next, and U.S. hegemony would continue forever. That's kind of the game plan. It's not quite working out. I think these sanctions were in the pipeline, no pun intended. Sanctions were in the pipeline for a very long time before the Ukraine war. It was hoped it would destroy Russia, wreck Russia's economy. However, the Russian state and the Russian economy is far more robust than I thought it would be. So also, in a deeper sense, it's a proxy war between U.S. imperialism and the global South. There's this New York activist, Danny Shore. I'd love to interview him. He's in the PSL, and I have disagreements with the PSL, big disagreements. They're a bit amorphous, but interviews with Danny Shore, he strikes me as a really badass revolutionary. He teaches at a community college in New York, and he's very active in the Central American left. He has a story, and I might have mentioned this earlier. He was in Nicaragua for some conference back in March, and a lot of people from the Latin American left were there. And a presenter from RT was at this conference, and when she got up, there were wild cheers, like, Putin, Putin. And Danny Shore said, this didn't represent political support for Putin per se, but support for Russia pushing back U.S. imperialism. Like the Latin American left, they know who the enemy is. It's not Russia. They know who the enemy is. It's not Russia. I mean, when Russia wins, there'll be wild cheering in Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Venezuela, so many other places. They know who the enemy is. So, it's and also on a deeper level, Russia isn't imperialist. Doesn't fit Lenin's theory of imperialism exporting finance capital. Russia is not imperialist. Their foreign interventions since the Soviet Union collapsed were entirely in self-defense. Now, if you follow the details, they're in self-defense. Now, people say Russia is imperialist. They usually mean Syria. Syrian intervention, 2014. Keep in mind, Syrian civil war is really complicated. Keep in mind, Operation Timber Sycamore, the U.S. spent at least $5 billion creating like an urban protest movement. 2011 was turned to a vicious jihadi war, and CIA has been heavily involved in Syria since the French got out. There was a coup in 1949, I believe, and a botched parliamentary coup in 1951. The motivation for joining Egypt, the United Arab Republic, was CIA meddling, protection from U.S. imperialism. So CIA and U.S. imperialism has played a profound role in Syria over the decades. So this is important to keep in mind. So Russian intervention occurred in 2014. U.S. policy in Syria was complicated and often at cross purposes. True, that's opportunistic and sometimes confused. That's absolutely true. But the end game was the destruction of Syria, the destruction of overthrow Assad. The U.S. said this over and over and over again. John Kerry actually said the idea was attack Fari state, like Islamist state in central Syria, which is kind of what happened with ISIS. Russia intervened and prevented this from happening. They intervened when it came out that there's going to be a direct military conflict, as Jim Kavanaugh said. I interviewed him. There's going to be a direct military confrontation between the U.S. military and the Syrian Arab Army, i.e., the U.S. are going to overthrow Assad, and that would have been Syria would have been like Libya. And that would have been a geopolitical catastrophe. Syria is geographically not that far from Russia, would have been extremely destabilizing for Russia, a large area of the Middle East, would have been a hotbed of jihadi elements. Russian intervention prevented this, pushed the jihadis into Idlib. They're still there. The U.S., by the way, is still in Syria, illegally occupying 40% of the country, including the oil-producing region, the agriculture region, with the support of the Kurds, or the YPG and a lot of Western anarchists who support them. Keep that in mind. So Russian intervention was because Russia has a military base in Latakia. As I understand, the start of the Syrian civil war was mothballed anyway. So keep that in mind. So Russian intervention in Syria was a very good thing, was a progressive thing. They did it for reasons of their own, but this is the first time since Soviet Union collapsed, or even since the 80s, that someone pushed back against U.S. imperialism, pushed it back and won to some extent. First time, and you're like, you're not. There was a big outrage on the left, parts of the big division on the left, big bitter fighting. There's Louis Pryak, or the former ISO. I strongly disagree, like Third Campus or anti-imperialist. I strongly disagree with that. U.S. imperialism is the most destructive force on the planet. Keep in mind, U.S. has, I think, the last military budget passed recently, something close to $800 billion. That's insane. It's like close to really $1 trillion. That's more than I believe is less 8 or 12 countries combined. The U.S. has at least officially 800 bases around the world, really close to 900, counting the lily pad bases. The U.S. in recent decades has destroyed Libya, made it from the most well-developed, highly developed country in Africa to a place where they're openly selling slaves, has destroyed Iraq, the most developed country in the Middle East, or not the most developed, but one of the most prosperous countries in the Middle East with a large middle class, destroyed that society, destroyed Syria, destroyed Afghanistan. In the 1980s, made Central America into a butcher shop. Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, was basically openly bragging how killing 500,000 Iraqi children was worth it. And killing 500,000 Iraqi children, this is what the U.S. did. Assad didn't do it. China didn't do it. North Korea didn't do it. Venezuela didn't do it. The U.S. did it. The U.S. is the only country on the planet capable of doing this. U.S. imperialism is drenched in an ocean of blood and is next to climate change, which is closely related to, is the most destructive force on the planet. And that's what we're seeing here. U.S. imperialism is by far the most destructive force on the planet. And the multipolar world will be much healthier. It won't be socialism. It'll be dominated by state capitalist countries, but it will be far healthier. Vastly get U.S. imperialism out of the picture. The human race rather has a possibility to survive. That's how I see it. Okay, now, so next thing, the working class of, and I probably mentioned this in earlier videos, it's worth repeating, the working class of Ukraine. Okay, well, first, I've been following Patrick Lancaster and some other like photojournalists who's been covering the Donbass, and much of the working class regards the Russians as liberators. They're not going to rise up and kick out the Russians. They are the Russians. They welcome them as liberators, which they are. I don't know public opinion in Western Ukraine. I know Zelensky, when it picked up, is that Zelensky is very unpopular. He's widely known to be corrupt. And Zelensky's Ukraine resembles Pinochet's Chile. At least a dozen mayors have disappeared. All opposition media is banned. All opposition political parties are banned. Again, the SBU, Ukrainian State Security, is targeting, killing people. It's literally a kill list. Mirovat's kill list is put out by the Ukrainian Ministry of the Interior. Many dozens of children, like people 12 and under, are on this list. Roger Waters from Pink Floyd is on this list. So yeah, working class solidarity. Well, I just say what happened in the Chechen wars. Russia had two brutal wars with Chechnya. They were able to turn this around. Partly they cultivated more pro-Russian leadership in Chechnya, and they pumped a lot of money into it. And they were also kind of, some extent, able to say to the Chechens, look, they did this to you. Like, the Chechen struggle became dominated by jihadists, really vicious jihadists, Al-Qaeda types, and the CIA undoubtedly had a big role in it. I don't have the details, and I can't swear on this, but so many Russians were able to say, like, the Empire did this to you. U.S., not directly saying this, but U.S. imperialism did this to you. They want to use you to destroy us. So they can do this with Ukraine. Okay? I know, 5, 10, 20 years from now, Ukraine, whatever is left of Ukraine, is going to be fanatically anti-West. They're going to hate the West for the next 1,000 years. This is what the West did this to Ukraine, not Russia. The West pushed Ukraine in this situation. After Zelensky was elected, was originally very popular. He was elected president with 70-something percentage of the vote. He got wide support from the Russian population in Ukraine. And he initially did make a few efforts to get these militias to stand down. After that failed, Zelensky rapidly acquiesced. He gave the head of the Azov battalion the Ukrainian Medal of Honor, or whatever. He acquiesced, and became apparent that Zelensky wasn't going to do anything. His popularity plummeted to around 30%. So nobody wanted this war. The original civil war started in 2014, was very unpopular in Ukraine. Ukrainian people did not want this war. They were pushed into it. Could have been avoided any time, like December of last year, December, January. Biden would have clearly stated that Ukraine is not going to join NATO. Don't worry, Ukraine will never be in NATO. And the whole thing could have been avoided. But nope, they're using Ukraine as a proxy war to destroy Russia. And Ukrainian people are going to know this. It's going to be occupied by Russia. They're going to pump a lot of Chinese investment and rebuild it. They're going to revamp the education system. My hunch, anyway, my hunch, could be wrong, my hunch, the Ukrainians are going to, like 20 years from now, or even 5 years from now, they're going to hate the West. Well, they're going to blame Russia. They're going to blame the West. They're going to hate the West for the next 1,000 years justifiably. So my hunch, how this plays out. Finally, Russia being fascist. Well, that comes from a couple different sources. Nonsense. It comes from a couple different sources. It's in one of the narratives designed to inhibit the development of an anti-imperialist left. Basically, this guy, Timothy Snyder, who's a Yale historian. He's a current court historian of U.S. imperialism. Hillary Clinton's famous historian. I wrote this book, Bloodlands. I haven't read reviews. It kind of, as I understand, it's about fighting. Essentially, it says the Nazis and the communists were the same thing. Not the same thing, but they were just as bad, which I think is nonsense. But he's a liberal historian, and he's a prolific writer. He writes articles everywhere, basically claiming the narrative that Russia is fascist. He takes these, and I read critiques of what he does. Some of these articles say that, there was an incident a couple of years ago where a Russian ultra-nationalistic fascist group marched in the Victory Parade in Moscow. And this was very controversial, a lot of criticism. It's not going to happen again. Well, Timothy Snyder mentioned this, and he makes it seem like it's the norm. It happens all the time. He takes things out of context. He takes highly unusual things, makes it seem like it's the norm, and he just makes up stuff anyway. So a big part of the narrative that Russia is fascist comes from Timothy Snyder. It's one. Well, another source that comes from is a British so-called alternative media outfit called Bellingcat. Project of this guy Elliot Higgins. It's really MI6 CIA operation. They're kind of like The Intercept, They're edgy. They go against imperialist narratives to some extent, just to reinforce them. A lot of tons of these stories about Russia being fascist comes out of Bellingcat. Why they call it Belling crap on alternate media sites. Most people know what they're like. And that's one source it comes from. And another, well, there are a couple other people. There's this guy, what's his name? Alexander Reed Ross. I did a video on him a while back. Alexander Reed Ross. Some of the narrative that Russia, that Dugin, for example. Alexander Dugin, he's a philosopher. His importance has been massively overdone. He's actually a marginal figure. The media call him, he's called the brains behind Putin. No, he isn't. He and Putin have never met. He doesn't appear to have had any influence on Putin at all. He was fired. In 2014, he wanted a very hardline policy towards Ukraine. This was unpopular. There were illusions in the West and Russian leadership, and he was fired from his job at Moscow State University, possibly at the behest of Putin himself. He was denied media access for a while. You know, he's more well known in the U.S. than he was in Russia. The idea that he's like Putin's Rasputin is total nonsense. Putin's ideologist, his theories, it's nonsense. Not true at all. The Western media massively inflated his appearance. So some of these tropes that put that Dugin runs this fascist international, and there's groups like anti-imperialist group, Workers' World, PSL, Max Blumenthal, Jimmy Dore, Glenn Greenwald, dozens of others, or this Red Brown Strasserite International with Putin and Dugin masterminding. It's total nonsense. By the way, they've been blaming Dugin for the invasion of Ukraine. It's nonsense too. The left, the Russian left, the two communist parties with a large mass following. The Communist Party is the second largest party in Russia. The two parties, one also wanted a very hardline policy towards Ukraine 2014. You could just as well blame Gennady Zyuganov as Dugin. I'm not a fan of Dugin. But you could just as well blame the Russian left. So the narratives don't really make too much sense. I mean, sure, there are some unsavory characters, some of the ultra-Russian nationalists in the Donbass. Yeah, some unsavory characters, but the whole narrative that Russia is fascist does not make sense. The narrative is being put forth to inhibit the development of an anti-imperialist left. And the anti-imperialist left should primarily against or entirely against U.S. interference, U.S. aid to Ukraine, and so on. Okay, I am a Trotskyist. I'll just briefly end with some stuff. Trotsky said his thought is really misunderstood by a lot of people. There's this group, Socialist Resurgence. I was sort of close to them for a time. I disagree with their foreign policy, strongly disagree. They had this article called The Anti-Imperialism of Fools, where, by the way, the Socialist Resurgence was split from Socialist Action, and they joined part of the former ISO, sort of like Third Campus. Like they're anti-imperialist. This whole line I strongly disagree with. And I think Trotsky himself was originally a strong anti-imperialist. If you read some of his stuff, he was a strong anti-imperialist. He would have hated these Louis Prayek types. Okay, anyway, so Socialist Resurgence had this article called The Anti-Imperialism of Fools. They took this article, riffed off this article by Trotsky called Learn to Think, and they took it completely out of context and made it the exact opposite of what Trotsky was trying to say. I'll end on this. Trotsky in 1938 had an interview, and by the way, he had an interview in 1938, and part of it, he mentioned this hypothetical war between a, quote, democratic Britain and a fascist Brazil. And Brazil at that time did have the Vargas dictatorship, kind of a fascistic government. It was a hypothetical war. Trotsky said he would, without hesitation, support Brazil. He says, no, it doesn't mean any support for fascism. So Brazil would have a government, a revolutionary could only regard with abhorrence. But keep in mind, if Britain wins, could replace the Brazilian leadership with someone even worse. And it is unstated, Trotsky didn't mention this, but Britain was declining, but they were the global hegemon at the time, a little bit like the U.S. is right now. So I think Trotsky, if he were alive today, he would support Russia. And most Trotskyist groups have all of them have such a horrible take on it. Russia is an imperialist, it's a war for self-defense. That's my take on it, and like every video, a whole bunch of things I wish I wish I had said that. Which I've forgotten. But anyway, if you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe. I'm gonna, near future, I'm thinking about doing a live stream. Gotta be a little prepared, do a live stream where people can ask questions. I'll see how it goes. I'm going to advertise on Facebook. I'm not going to do it right away, maybe a couple of weeks from now. I'm kind of thinking about it, see how things play out. Anyway, if you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe. I said that already. And thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good day.